Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And in honor of International Women's Day, we have a magnificent presentation for you, Seeing the Hidden Gender Dynamics of Engineering by Dr. Ann-Louise Howard. This is offered by the Center for Human Relations and Community Studies, and I'd like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the center. The center is 60 years old this year, started in 1963, and is the first continuously operating center at Concordia University. Of course, it was back then Sir George Williams as well, so both of those universities. The center is dedicated to the flourishing of communities, organizations, groups, and individuals. And one of the things that we're quite conscious of is in this post-pandemic era, as we enter our relationships, our work worlds, our family and personal connections, that in a certain way, we've been out of touch for a while. We've been in a different reality. And so to that end, many of the programs offered by the center intend to help us not only get back to, in quotes, what was normal, but to move well beyond that to new ways of flourishing and being. So we're back, but what's the quality of our being at this time? In the next month, we'll be having a webinar on a very unique topic, inner absencing, ghosting ourselves in the post-pandemic era. Dr. Eva Pomeroy, an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Applied Human Sciences and a core member of the Presencing Institute in Massachusetts, will be offering a session on this incredible notion of what has happened to us in this period of time. As well, in the summer of 2023, we will be hosting two important workshops. The first is a human interaction laboratory, and this is a foundational workshop designed to enhance our understanding of how we show up in these times and how we interact in order to help us gain traction and new wisdom in our personal and professional relationships. A second session that will be occurring simultaneously with the first is developing the organizational and personal self. This is an advanced workshop, again, designed to build greater self-knowledge and fluency in relationships. So for tonight, we have Seeing the Hidden Gender Dynamics of Engineering, Part 1. This is offered by Dr. Ann-Louise Howard. I want to say a few things about Ann-Louise. She's a scholar, organization development consultant, and has a very rich and diverse background. Following a career spanning engineering, program management, ethics, and organization development in the high-tech sector, she is now an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Human Sciences at Concordia, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in organization development and learning. Her doctoral research, which she'll be talking about tonight, focused on women engineers' experiences of suffering in the workplace. And she's also a consultant specializing in helping organizations be more inclusive to women in engineering. In addition to her doctorate from Concordia, she holds a bachelor's in engineering from McGill and an MA in human systems intervention from Concordia. Without further ado, for Dr. Ann-Louise Howard. Ann-Louise?
Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you to the Center for Human Relations and Community Studies for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. I have to say that being introduced as Dr. Ann-Louise Howard still has a lovely ring to it. I just defended my thesis in the summer, so it's quite nice, quite a nice experience to share with all of you today as well. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Jojaje Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. And as we gather here to learn about and discuss the marginalization of women in engineering, much of which was invisible to me until I did my doctoral research, I invite you to join me in recognizing with humility the many forms of marginalization in engineering, including that of Indigenous peoples. I'm learning that Indigenous peoples have always been engineers, designing solutions to serve communities, an identity that's been deliberately excluded from the colonial patriarchal model of engineering. We're encouraged to decolonize our field and integrate the practice of two-eyed seeing, which harnesses and harmonizes the strengths of both Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. The robust inclusion of Indigenous peoples, and particularly of Indigenous women, is vital to designing solutions that protect our environment and the most vulnerable communities across the planet. So today I'm excited to share my research with you on women engineers' experience of suffering in the workplace. And as you'll see, this deep exploration of the experiences of 6 women engineers from across Canada and from various disciplines, backgrounds, and ages unexpectedly became a window into the often hidden gender dynamics in engineering that women experience. Let me share how today's webinar will go. So first, we're going to do part 1 today, and part 2 will be next week, and I will explain that a little bit more at the end of the session. And before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about who's here today. I scanned the registration data yesterday, and we have people from all across Canada. I could see that people from the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, and the Western provinces, and possibly even people from outside of Canada. 3/4 of you identified as women in engineering, including students, people from academia, from industry, and from professional engineering orders, and former engineers. And about 1/4 of you do not identify as women in engineering, but I could see that many of you are curious allies. And for the handful of you who had no relationship to engineering, first I want to welcome you, and I want to tell you that according to Engineers Canada, there's a low public awareness of what engineering is and what engineers do. And it's a broad profession that draws on scientific knowledge to solve practical problems for society. And it can have a mythical quality with harmful stereotypes about who belongs and who doesn't. And we're going to explore that more today. So for part 1 today, we're going to review the existing research on women in engineering, including my own. We're going to explore microaggressions and try to understand the gendered microaggressions that are unique to engineering and have a unique dynamic. And then we'll spend some time at the end for questions. In part 2, we're going to be, it's going to be quite a different type of webinar. This is just for for people who identify as women in engineering. It's going to be a more intimate space to share experiences and make sense of experiences. So before we go into the research, I have a question for all of you. And I'm going to ask you, what are you noticing in the environment that relates to women in engineering? And this part I will monitor in the chat, but I'd like you to put in the chat, what are some of the things you're noticing in your environment related to women in engineering? I'm going to read out a few as you go along. Thank you so much for adding to the chat. They're asked to speak on March 8th each year. Not enough attention, gendered roles. Example on 4th year design teams. Yes, Slowly seeing more women join the workforce, not many women in engineering in management positions. There are a lot more of us is a direct message to me. Posts on LinkedIn if you're connected to such groups. Assuming they aren't engineers, that they're receptionists. Women in Engineering Association is bigger. They're the ones who handle the people problems. Not enough of them. Sorry, it's moving quickly. Leaky pipeline. I'm sorry if I'm missing some. We're a minority in engineering. Questions about what we can change versus what is innate and to be accepted. Oh, interesting. Not listened to until my male coworker repeats. Assuming only women in engineering can mentor women in engineering and getting completely isolated from male mentors and professors. Lots of, I don't understand why there are not enough. Women in HR, that's it. I'm not quite sure what that means. Happy to hear if you want to elaborate. The lack of women in leadership roles. So some of these things I think you'll begin to see as I present some of the research that exists. Sometimes need a male manager to back up a female manager's stance for it to be taken seriously. Lack of career role models. Okay, thanks. And you can continue those. Please continue those. And as we go through the presentation, I'd like to say that I think there'll be a range of reactions amongst you to the research. So depending on your positionality, depending on your own experience, some of you may find that the findings surprising, even hard to believe if that hasn't been your experience. For others, the experience may seem familiar, but you've never really put words to them. And for even others, the experience may resonate very strongly, as some have told me. Okay, I'm gonna move along. So I just want to share before we get into the research some caveats. So the first one being that just some research limitations. So most of the research on women in engineering that exists today is silent on intersectional experiences. So we could say with a broad brush that that these studies predominantly reflect white women's experiences and neglect the experiences of people whose identities as women intersect with other traditionally minoritized identities. So where the research does focus on specific intersectional experiences, those of women of color, from the LGBT community, et cetera, I'll highlight that in the research. The second caveat is that engineering is not a monolith. Engineering includes a range of organizational cultures. So, you know, a software engineering office might have one culture and a manufacturing facility quite a different culture. So we're not talking about all one thing. So I'd like to keep that in mind as we go through. Another example, you know, an offsite environment on an oil rig or, you know, in a shipyard, very different cultures from an office environment. So as we talk about this, there's also that range. Now I'm just going to share the existing research on women in engineering. This is not my research, it's available out there. I have a list of references at the end of the slides, but I'm going to go through 4 areas. One is what I call the problem, in quotes, of women in engineering. And then I'll take you through the male-dominated history of engineering, the systemic disadvantages, and then the coping strategies that are in the research. Again, this is not my research, but this is what's out there today. So first of all, I put it as the problem of women in engineering in quotations, because often it's seen as if women have a deficit and that's the problem that needs to be solved. And I in many ways reject that piece. But I want to share, first of all, that efforts abound to attract and retain women in engineering. There's 50 years of research and intervention. And, you know, despite that, the progress is slow. So I found in 1987, women made up 50% of university enrollment, while only 13% of engineering students were women. And today, women make up 24% of engineering students and 14% of practicing engineers. So progress has been slow. And Engineers Canada has a national goal of raising the percentage of newly licensed engineers to 30% by the year 2030. And I would have to say, by looking at some of their data, that that goal is at risk. The next, once in engineering, women don't stay in comparison to men. So the research shows that women leave the profession at higher rates, that they suffer higher rates of burnout, and they disproportionately shift to roles that are seen as more feminine, less technical, what's some call pink collar engineering jobs. So, if we look at that and we see there's a lot of, what is this problem? Do we really understand the problem well if we're putting so much effort and not getting the results that might be expected? So let me take you through engineering's white, heteronormative, male-dominated history. And in the late 1800s, there was a split or a bifurcation that took place to establish engineering as what was real engineering, and that was typically performed by men. So what happened was, at the time, there was a desire for legitimacy, to be accepted and respected the way lawyers, doctors were. And they shifted the work. There was real engineering work and there was para-engineering work. So we're talking about drafting, calculating, those kinds of things that was typically done by women and minorities, and they were excluded from the profession. And at the time also is when songs and chants emerged that really reinforced that white, heteronormative, masculine nature of engineering. So it goes back quite a ways. Pardon me. In the 1970s, researchers found there was a work hard and play culture, hostile, misogynistic, anti-artsy expressions. Women and sex were used actually to sell engineering. So images of male sexuality dominated the play culture back in the 70s. Pornographic images in yearbooks and student publications. I studied in the late 80s, and there were still remnants of that. They had just shut down the plumber's pot at McGill, and there were underground versions of those in the 80s, late 80s. And then the play culture shifted to more of a party drinking culture over the next 25 years. In the 1980s, researchers found that hostility and resentment still persists. Jokes elevated engineers over others, including women. And a lot of those jokes had to do with technical competence, rationality, emotionality, and were derisive to women. And finally, even in the 2010s, it reported in the news sexist, violent, and degrading materials, and possibly more. So this is, the male-dominated part of engineering has a deep history. I want to take you through some of the systemic disadvantages that women have. Again, this is from the research. One, in early socialization, girls tend to be insulated from experiences studying math, to tinker, and to see themselves as engineers. I think this is clear, and there's a lot of interventions to help bridge that gap. In education, some of the researchers found, studying women in engineering, that women have to work harder to fit in, that women often do not object and even join the male-dominated culture in order to fit in and not be a threat to the culture. Many find that women succeed academically, but being socialized into the masculine culture while covering any anxieties with an appearance of confidence. And throughout their education, it was found that women experience a masculine culture. Attention's uncomfortably called to their gender. Gender expectations are imposed. Women's interests are looked down upon. In some studies, they found Black women's experiences were flush with expectations and stereotypes of them. Stereotypes, they're too angry, too feminine, not prepared for the academic demands of engineering. And as well, anti-gay bias and anti-gay comments couched in technical engineering language. So this is just a quick summary of some of the things, some of the disadvantages in education, including some intersectional experiences. And finally, in the profession, well, as I mentioned, they found a range of cultures, and the gendered culture can be quite subtle. Perhaps it's, calling all engineers he, for example, or polite conversations between men and women and more casual between men. And it can also be quite egregious depending on the culture: sexist, racist, homophobic jokes and insults. So these are, there's a wide range of those cultures. And, like in education, they face marginalized interactions. Comments call attention to their gender, where women are expected to behave in traditionally feminine ways or do tasks traditionally done by women, which we saw earlier in the chat, where women are not seen, not heard, or they're ignored. We saw that also in the chat, where their technical competence is questioned by default. There's also research showing that women don't share the same privileges as men in engineering. So just the privilege of being assumed competent, to be not sexually harassed, or to have a sense of belonging or feeling welcome. And researchers have found the stronger the masculine culture of engineering, the more poorly women do in the profession. So that's just a little glimpse at the systemic disadvantages that women face throughout their early life and education and in the profession. So a lot of the research that I found had a lot of different coping strategies, but I will say, and these coping strategies were remarkably consistent. They point to almost exclusively to strategies to survive and tough it out, rather than strategies to understand and change the systemic issues. And there are fundamentally, from what I found, two basic coping strategies. I'll take you through the first. The first being adapt to the environment. So this is number one. They use impression management to convey they're one of them and not a threat to the culture. They project confidence. They focus on the work. They downplay aspects of their femininity and intersectional identity, adjust their behavior to dispel stereotypes. They prove themselves or work extra hard to earn respect for their technical competence. They armor up for meetings with extra preparation and data in anticipation of questions. They preempt any doubt in their abilities by offering their credentials. They develop a tough skin. They downgrade their expectations about their career. And Black women were cautious in their interactions with peers to assuage others' discomfort. Now, the second way that women cope is to downplay or deny sexism. And the denial of sexism in engineering is one coping strategy that merits highlighting because of its stark contrast to the evidence and its powerful impact on maintaining the status quo. So I would even say, in my own experience, I just didn't think it was really relevant whether I was a man or a woman. So a lot of things were quite hidden to me. But I will say, an example of the evidence is that there's a recent survey by the Ordre des Ingénieurs du Québec that says that women engineers experience 3 times as much more discrimination, than women in the general public, 3 times. So this denial and downplaying of sexism really has a big impact. So ways that they do this: they deny sexism to preserve their non-threatening status and protect themselves from alienation. They tend to think of engineering as gender neutral, as I did. They rationalize any sexist behavior as exceptional. So, there's a bad apple, and as long as there's no bad apples, everything is fine. They tend to minimize even overt acts of sexism. Again, this is coming from the research of the coping mechanisms. They express great pride in making it a man's world and enjoy the recognition that gives them. They work hard to be seen as one of the boys. They distance themselves from women who do not follow the unspoken rules. They distance themselves from other women in STEM who display femininity, engage in feminine practices, and name structural sexism as a problem. And finally, women engineering students adopted an anti-woman stance as a way of distancing themselves from their identity. So I'm going to shift to my research now. We've just covered the research that's out there about women in engineering. And my research was specifically called, I didn't know it was a thing either, Women Engineers' Experience of Suffering in the Workplace. I'm going to share with you my findings. I always find it, in one slide, I'm presenting a summary of what I think is a very rich experience for my participants. And one slide will never do it justice, but I do want to share the major themes that came up and then how I link it to microaggressions, because that became a bridge from, my research became a bridge from the current research to microaggression. So first finding is that women engineers experience the engineering workplace as a threatening context where it's not, quote unquote, normal to be a woman in engineering. So, when I first wrote that it's not normal to be a woman engineer, I felt a little anxiety, like I can't say that. But actually, it just is, in so much of the research out there substantiates this. Second, women engineers focus on coping with the threat in the present moment while not noticing their evolving suffering. So suffering, according to my research and others, is a process where the suffering begins, it's lived with and dealt with, over time, and then it peaks and then it has a lasting impact. And a lot of women, the women that I spoke to, really didn't notice that evolving suffering in that process. I also found that women engineers struggled privately and alone, quite isolated. Women engineers cope by using a narrow set of learned strategies. So in my case, and for my 6 women in my study, they maintained a high standard of performance. They were careful not to be too bold. I just want to emphasize the too bold. I would say just about every woman in engineering is bold, but my study found be careful not to be too bold. And then finally, to handle it. These were the strategies that were used. Another finding was that women engineers tough it out. And to tough it out, they had to stay in control of the situation, in control of their emotions, particularly their anger. That came out strongly. I had a participant who, when I asked about emotions, said, well, I'm not really an emotional person, and struggled to really name emotions. But boy, oh boy, her interview was riddled with anger, riddled with anger. They disregard the price they're paying along the way. This one, women engineers question their sense of reality. So, just really incredulous at times, like, what is real here? What is going on? A lot of confusion about, am I seeing this clearly or not? And the last one is that women engineers are trapped in an impossible problem to solve. So as they're going through that suffering process, they're really trapped and not knowing how they, and not even necessarily noticing that they're trapped. So these are my findings. And I want to share with you what I did after this was I said, okay, well, what did I find? And how is it, does this exist in the literature already? Because I've shown you the literature, but I didn't look at the literature until after I did this. And all of this was in the literature except for 3 things. So one was, I never heard about anyone's evolving suffering in the literature on women in engineering. That just didn't come up. Also, there was no mention of women engineers struggling privately and alone. And finally, women engineers questioning their sense of reality. I couldn't find that anywhere. Okay. So I was kind of looking elsewhere in the literature. And what I found was these dynamics that were taking place that I found in my participants who were suffering were all of them take place with microaggressions. And just before I shift onto that, I want to say that when I looked at the literature, no one else was studying suffering, and yet they were coming up with all of these things. So it was just an everyday part of women in engineering's lives, these other things. So with that, I really found my research was a bridge between the existing research and microaggressions. The dynamics that I found with my participants mirrored microaggressions and wasn't really that different from the everyday existing reality of women in engineering. So, so this focus of mine, even though I studied perhaps extreme circumstances or severe circumstances, it turned out to be a window into the sometimes dangerous, covert gender dynamics of engineering that help maintain the status quo. And when I reviewed it against the existing research, I came up with some new provocative insights related to microaggressions. And I'm going to share those with you in a little bit. And they also point to unique gendered microaggressions, unique to the profession. And they suggest that how the engineering culture likely intensifies microaggressions, hidden dynamics, and contributes to women's invalidation and suffering. I'm going to explain that a little bit. And while many women navigate these microaggressions very well, sometimes even effortlessly because they've been encultured in this for many years, they can come to have a profound effect on women engineers' lives, as they did on my participants. So let me just share a little overview of microaggressions. And Sue really popularized this term microaggressions. And he defines them as everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostility, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So he's not specifying gender in this case. It's really around dominant groups, non-dominant groups. And I just love this quote, microaggressions are outward expressions of implicit worldviews about who is superior, who is normal, and who belongs. And I use the metaphor of an iceberg, and let me explain why I use that. So related to, for microaggressions, even though they use the term micro, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily small. It means that they're everyday, can happen every day. And overt ones are clear and unambiguous, direct messages. Some call it old-fashioned sexism, racism, etc. Those are the things that are above the surface. We see them clearly. And in fact, of course, there's less and less because they become increasingly unacceptable. But they're also, according to some researchers, actually less harmful because they're so clear. It's when they're hidden and they're subtle, ambiguous, indirect messages that suggest you're not the norm, they become more difficult to process, to get through. And so I'm going to talk about this, the dynamics of the hidden discrimination, the hidden microaggressions. And just one last thing, I want to say that microaggressions are only limited by the types of stereotypes and biased assumptions that exist. So in that case, there's gendered microaggressions, but with intersectional experiences, they actually compound because they're faced with gendered microaggressions, racial microaggressions, etc. So I just want to highlight that. So when there are these hidden microaggressions, there's what's called a clash of realities. So for the target, the person who's the target of microaggressions, they experience the hostility, derogatory, or negative messages, but although it's often ambiguous. So it's not really clear, did that really happen? Did I really understand that? Sometimes it can just be so nuanced, so subtle that we're not sure. And in terms of the perpetrator's experience, who may not even be aware of their implicit bias, they really, and they don't know the hurtful nature of their actions, they can be like a totally different reality for them. No, it didn't happen. I didn't mean it. They could be very well intentioned, but just don't understand their underlying bias. So in that moment of a microaggression, the target faces a dilemma. And the dilemma is, if I raise the issue, then I actually risk being invalidated or minimize the impact. And this is like a secondary microaggression. So I raise it, I'm invalidated. Now it's a second hurtful experience. If I stay silent, then I may feel devalued. So it's really a tight spot. You know, when I said earlier that women are trapped in an impossible problem to solve, that's very similar to a microaggression. And research shows also that the strain of microaggressions can actually accumulate and has been linked to trauma symptoms. That's how painful that accumulation of everyday acts and invalidation, it can lead to trauma symptoms. So with that link between microaggressions and my research, I offer 6 provocative propositions, 6 insights. And I define provocative, well, this is not me, this is the Oxford Dictionary's causing anger or another strong reaction, especially deliberately. And I guess I don't really have to say this, but it almost gives me permission to know, yeah, what I'm going to say might disrupt, might disturb. And that there's something inside me that thinks like, oh, I don't want to be disruptive, but I do want to be disruptive. So the first one, and these are my insights based on my research and my analysis, is that the engineering profession is rife with microaggressions against against women. And women engineers experience microaggressions within society and specific to engineering. And there's unique beliefs, implicit bias in engineering. One, for example, that technology is masculine. That is deep in our society, that technology is related to masculinity. Another belief is that real engineers are tinkerers. And certainly, we see that girls are not socialized the same way as boys in that regard. And also that engineers' masculine rationality is superior. So superior to emotions and that sort of thing. And those deeply held beliefs can surface as microaggressions. The second one is it's likely that all women engineers experience the strain of microaggressions and have the potential to suffer from them, the potential to suffer. Oftentimes, women in engineering, according to the research, they don't notice them because they're so normal. They take it for granted. And they're so adept at handling them, and they don't notice the toll it takes on them. Finally, the nature of the profession may intensify women's experiences of microaggressions. So the nature of the profession, the cultural beliefs can discourage their visibility. It can encourage invalidation of their sense of reality. If rationality is so valued, and I have, and I see this very ambiguous thing, I'm feeling something inside me, but in the clash of realities, rationality wins, then it can exacerbate microaggressions. And it can even prevent people from speaking up about them. The fourth one is that there's an underestimation of the price women engineers pay while coping with their threatening context. And there's very little research on the impact of the male-dominated culture on women. I've seen words like stress and strain, but I'm telling you, my participants suffered. And since releasing this research, I'm hearing from other women who have suffered, and I don't take that word lightly. So there's a range of price that women can pay. And again, engineering is not a monolith. Not all cultures are the same. So it's not everyone, for sure, who reach that kind of level of trauma. Women engineers who experience suffering in the workplace may be trapped in shame. So this one is a little trickier to explain, but shame is experienced to varying levels of awareness and can be very confusing. So this is based on some research from the 70s. Sometimes we're not even aware of shame. And shame is often experienced with respect to unwanted identities. So, a woman might not want to appear too feminine. That might be shameful. Or sorry, I'm trying to think of another example. But there's these unwanted identities, too feminine, not a tinkerer, these kinds of things. And with shame, women are trapped, powerless, and isolated in a web of competing expectations. And finally, I would say the denial of gender in engineering is a social defense against disruptive change. So despite evidence, the myth that engineering is gender neutral persists and helps to maintain the status quo. And the near obsession with attracting and retaining women in engineering serves as a presenting problem that keeps a systemic inequality within engineering hidden. So with that ends my presentation. And I'm going to share one last slide and invite all people here who identify as women in engineering. And we talked about that earlier. It's a very inclusive, broad way of inviting anyone who feels that way. You're all welcome to join for more sharing of experiences, sense making together. And that will be next week on March 15th from 5 to 6:30. And the registration is still open for that. So I really want to thank everyone here today. And I'm going to pass it back to Marilyn, who's going to share a little bit about an upcoming event.
So, hi everyone. My name is Marilyn. I'm with the Center for Human Relations and Community Studies. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your participation and hope you valued today's presentation. On behalf of the Center, I'd like to thank Dr. Ann-Louise Howard. We're extremely grateful to have had this opportunity to share her research with you. So for more information on the Center's webinars and workshops, as you see on the screen, please visit our website, concordia.ca/CHRCS. I will be sending a follow-up email to let you know when the recording of the presentation portion will be available. Included will also be a link to a brief survey for any comments and feedback you have. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.
Thank you.